Brunandar, everyone. Welcome to our March Progression and Assessment Network meeting. I hope that you're all well. It's not long until Easter. We're nearly at the end of term. We're nearly there. James sends his apologies, but he's recorded a message for us, along with a request for some support. So we'll hear from him in a second, even though he's not able to join us. This afternoon, we'll also be hearing from 3 of our curriculum partners to continue looking at what progression looks like within the AOLEs. And this builds on our presentations from our last session when we met, where we looked at maths, science and RVE. And if you do have any questions for the team, I'm sure they'll be happy to answer at the end of their presentation. So if I move on and hand over to James and his little recording.
Brenda, hope everyone's well. I'm sure by now you're looking forward to the Easter break. I'm sorry I can't be with you today, but I am currently out on a school visit. What I wanted to do is to share with you an opportunity to get involved with the research study that sits at the heart of my professional doctorate. Now, the title of my professional doctorate is to explore practices that shape teachers' enactment of Welsh assessment policy. And within the project, I'm looking to identify 3 main things. So firstly, what enables and constrains teachers' engagement with assessment practices as set out in Curriculum for Wales. Secondly, I'm seeking to understand how teachers interpret and translate policy into practice. And finally, I'm looking to work with groups of school teachers to construct a range or co-construct a range of practices through which assessment policy can be enacted in practice. Now, the long-term goal of this research is that it will be used to try and develop some recommendations for future practices and future work. So that design of this study has now received ethical approval from Cardiff Met, and I'm looking for a school who would be interested in partnering with me on this pilot study. So if that isn't something that you're interested in, something that you feel would be appropriate for you in terms of where you are with your work at the moment, then please do get in touch with me, drop me an email, and I can provide you with some more details in terms of the approaches and the timescales that we're looking to try to work towards. So diolch yn fawr, thank you very much. And thank you to Sarah for the rest of the session.
And now I'm going to go straight over to Liz Berry, who leads our expressive arts work across the region. And she's prepared a recording to look at what progression within that AOLE looks like.
Good afternoon, everybody. Prynhawn da. Apologies that I can't be with you live today. My name is Liz Berry and I'm the Associate Curriculum Partner for Expressive Arts. I thought long and hard about where to start, really. Sometimes the start is always the hardest. But I do feel that within Expressive Arts, the principles of progression are that mandatory field, mandatory part of the Curriculum for Wales, where in many terms have been our starting point when starting to really unpick progression and assessment within the expressive arts. So a very brief overview really of the principles of progression and how these feed in to the slides that will follow, and I'm sure you will start to see some connections being made as we go through. There is no sequence of how important each one is. They're just in an order, but as I say, one is not more important than the other. So starting with increasing effectiveness of a learner and how this looks in expressive arts. So this one really is about that gradual use and reuse of technical skills within expressive art. So for example, in art, you would class drawing potentially as a skill, or maybe in music you would then be looking at percussion. So those are examples of how we use and then reuse skills over time to really emphasize and support progression in those areas. This area also entails gaining further sophistication and refining those skills, and key terminology such as respond, evaluate, create, explore, experience, interpret. These are all common factors within that increasing effectiveness as a learner. So deepening understanding of ideas and disciplines within the areas. This one is really where we see the creative process being spoken about, being explained in further detail, and we will look at the creative process further on. But the creative process is something that runs throughout all of expressive arts and is applicable to all disciplines. And we will look at progression within the creative process a little further on. The breadth and depth of knowledge, so increasing the breadth and depth of knowledge, this is about linking new learning to existing knowledge, really thinking about sequencing within expressive arts in each discipline. This is about developing the sophistication of conceptual understanding and really looking at technical knowledge and skills. You will probably hear a lot of repetition of some of this terminology and phrasing, and that's why it's so important when we look at these in a little further detail. And then looking at refinement and growing sophistication in the use and application of skills. There's a great example of a dance as a discipline, looking at movement and choreography on the Curriculum for Wales paperwork. And then last but not least is the making connections and transferring learning into new contexts. So this is about transferring that knowledge and skills, how we can combine the disciplines and make that work organically, and start thinking about how we can get clear knowledge and skills within each discipline, even if we are combining them together and not sacrificing one over the other. Expressive arts is an incredibly diverse field, and this can make planning for progression and implementing effective assessment really challenging. We also have the side of expressive arts, which is very skill and knowledge based. So for example, if a child age around 6 or 7 usually forms very strong opinions of themselves as an artist, as a musician, as a dancer, which is usually formulated through experience and observation. So it is important to factor in the real creative process that gives you maybe that end result of a performance or an art piece. So for example, when exploring and looking at creative work, we need to factor in the progression of what that can look like. I will go into more detail on this a little later. The responding and reflecting, this really engages emotions and intellect, the analysis of creative work and how that can be factored in and how progression looks in that area. This also, I feel, is a key point in the creative process for implementing assessment and looking at formative assessment in particular, how that student is responding during the learning process, that opportunity to implement, improve and refine, not always maybe labeling something as wrong, but actually looking at how refining work will help improve that student's outcome or their work in that creative process. And then looking at the creating, and also remembering that the creative process is not a linear approach. It's non-linear. It doesn't have to start with responding or reflect, doesn't have to start with creating. It can be a cycle and can be implemented at any point. The principles of progression reference the gradual use and reuse of skills. It references the linking of new knowledge to existing knowledge or new learning to existing knowledge. It also looks at deepening the understanding and the application of the creative process. Now, the example I have on the screen is for drawing, but this can be applied across the disciplines. Now, in the middle, where you can see term 1, term 2, term 3 drawing, that tries to exemplify how you can embed the creative process in drawing across 3 different terms, and also that idea of sticky learning, of repeating a skill in order to refine and sophisticate that skill to a level, as you can see at the top, going through each progression step. Now, although this can appear repetitive, The approach, the creative process can be very different. The stimuli can be very different. It can be done alongside other AOLEs, for example. So it is repetitive in order to link the new learning with existing knowledge. However, it is important to have that sequencing and not have it too far apart where the learner will lose that knowledge and that skill in order to develop it further. Because if we space it out too much and try to do more, sometimes and very often the progression can be lost. So it's important to do less is more approach and quality over quantity when looking at particular skills in particular disciplines. The next 5 slides show progression maps that have been developed by myself and our partner schools. These progression maps have been divided into knowledge and skills for areas within each discipline. So for example, in art you may pick an element or form. It really is down to each individual creating a progression map, or each group or cluster that would be producing a progression map. And once a school has decided, ideally within their cluster, which elements, which forms they're going to focus on. So for example, in art, you may select drawing and painting. You can then start to work together to map out the progression and how it should look across the 3 to 16 continuum in your cluster. So please feel free to browse through the next 5 slides to show exemplars of how this can be done in expressive arts. Ysgol Gymraeg Casnewydd shared some fabulous examples of the creative process following their attendance on the curriculum design expressive arts course. And as you can see here, they have, even in progression step 1, looked at relevant artists. They have experimented. You can see examples of that. They have, on the next slide, you'll see how they have responded and done versions of interpretation of their own work. And I think this is a brilliant example of how the creative process and those knowledge and skills within, you can see there may be some colour theory and definitely drawing and line has been developed even within one project. This slide shows some great feedback, as you can see if you really look closely at the image on the left. And on the right, what is really wonderful to see is the use of drafts. So drafting the work and responding and redrafting and working towards whether you call it the end goal or the end piece, the outcome. But as you can see, there's clearly been a process, and this being embedded in progression step 1 is vital. I wanted to paint a picture how this can look from progression step 1 to progression step 5, and taking a theoretical example here of how the creative process, looking at, for example, the flower artwork from the Dutch painter on the left, and how that creative exploration and exploring, for example, here colour theory, developing knowledge of primary colour from progression step 1 to 2, looking into secondary colour, and then by progression step 5 having that agreement that you would look then at tertiary colour and colour combinations and complementary colour schemes. This is just an example of how that could progress with an agreement across the cluster with the 3 to 16 continuum. The creative process is the evolution of an idea into its final form through a progression of thoughts and actions. This can involve critical thinking, problem-solving skills. It can be viewed as steps taken to complete a body of work and a system used to produce original ideas. Now, this can obviously take different amounts of time. A creative process can be formulated for a one-off, maybe museum visit. It could be formulated for a short project, a medium-sized project, a longer project, and usually as the progression steps increase, so does maybe the length and the time given for the creative process. The curriculum for Wales states that although each discipline has its own discrete body of knowledge and skills, and therefore progression within that, it is recognised that they all share the creative process. On the screen at the moment is a model that I designed for a one-off visit that could then be adapted for a longer project. So this was a school going to Cardiff Museum and how they could show progression through the whole school were going to the museum, and then how they could use the creative process through a progressive way. So for example, the exploring column in yellow shows that each progression step, this may be divided up by classes or individual students, it really does depend on your setting, but you can see the progression of the exploring and the theoretical, let's say, themes or areas that progression step would look at. So progression step 1 could look through mark making, progression step 2 could look at landscapes, progression step 3 could look at portraits. However, this could very easily achieve the same level of progression if all were looking at portraits, but just looking at the difference between simple questioning and answering of the formation of line compared to progression step 3, where it's exploring and describing how portrait artists convey or communicate mood, feelings, and ideas. In the green columns, you can see that this is the responding and reflecting, so a real analysis of the creative work. There is no rule against creating happening earlier on, which is in the purple. This is just if you were doing maybe a visit to a museum, how it may be best planned. However, this is by no means the right way. It's just showing a way and a formation of doing it, and you can chop and change the responding and the creating and the exploring as you wish. But how I have mapped it out here, you can see, if you read a little more closely into the progression step 1, talk, listen about how a project makes you feel, maybe then compared to progression step 2, where learners could start giving that critical feedback on the artwork being observed and the colour and the shape and the texture. Now, it's important that when planning for progression step 1, 2 and 3 all feed into each other, something that we talked a little earlier about sequencing. The final column there, the creating. Now, obviously, if you're doing a visit to somewhere like a museum, it is great practice to do some early creating when you're there. How this can be done with a lot of children in one space, especially for taking whole school, can be a little more tricky. However, it is good practice to get students creating as they are observing work. So there is a clear example here of beginning to explore line in progression step 2 onto progression step 1 onto progression step 2, where it's applying drawing techniques to create a personal landscape. This could be early sketches done at the museum, or even photographs taken at the museum and discussions taken at the museum, and then bringing that back to the classroom. If this was based on the landscape outside our window, at school, this could be adapted completely for that setting. And then progression step 3 is combining that knowledge, experience, and understanding to plan and create a self-portrait. Although progression step 1, 2, and 3 have very different areas they're looking at, there would be nothing to say that this could take on portraiture across the whole school. I know that can be quite a popular exercise to do and project to do sometimes at the start of the academic year, and a portraiture project could work wonderfully with this model. The creative process really allows some wonderful assessment, including peer assessment, self-assessment, teacher assessment. It allows breaks in the creative process to allow observation, to allow feedback, to allow time to look at what's in front of us and decide what direction we're going to go into. This can obviously happen in lots of different formations and lots of different contexts. However, if you look at the example here, using that similar coding of the yellow being the exploring, it could be a chance after they've explored to pause and have some of that assessment, have some of that feedback. It could be that they do some creating earlier on, and that responding and reflecting could happen after the creating. So you can see here with the color coding, this is an example for reception. And this is using a popular expressive arts Christmas activity where, again, it could be adapted for lots of different projects, lots of different times of the year, and by no means is a one-off sort of one lesson approach. This can be divided into different parts, and if you were to look at that over different lessons, you would plan that accordingly. So what I do find interesting here is that you can very easily add columns in to plan your assessment in whichever formation that would be, and not always wait until the end, as we can sometimes get quite fixated. And therefore, if we get fixated, students and learners can get fixated on that end product or that end piece of art, that end performance being the ultimate goal. Although that can be a fantastic showcase of the skills that have been acquired over time, it is important to put the value on the creative process. And that's where I also advise students to be informed of the creative process, and to, as they start to do it, hopefully over their journey through the 3 to 16 continuum, it becomes second nature. Magor Primary have very kindly shared some of the work that they produced following some support with the creative process and how to plan a whole school project. This was a fantastic visual example of how progression can look across the school. I believe the project went on for quite a few weeks. They started towards the end of November, and they really took time to allow the children to explore the creative work of others. They started looking at formal research, they started looking at Christmas cards and different artists. And as you can see on the screen, this looks very differently across the progression steps. They went on to respond, and the following slides will illustrate this and show visual examples of how that can look. And then they also created, as they went through the creative process, they looked at doing drafts, and then they produced their final Christmas card at the end. And it was noted that the outcomes were much more individual and personal to those students than the school had seen before. So hopefully now you can have a look through some of those visual examples to really paint a picture of how that can look.
Well, thanks very much to Liz for preparing her presentation for us. It's absolutely brilliant to see the artwork and to see what schools have done following their work with Liz. And I know if you do have questions, as she said, her contact details are on the screen, and she would be very happy to respond to any questions. And so please just get in touch. And we're going to move on now to Bridie. Bridie leads our humanities AOLE, so we'll hand straight over. Thanks very much, Bridie.
Thanks, Sarah. Prynhawn da. Thank you, Sarah, for inviting me along this afternoon. For those of you on screen who've not met me before, as Sarah said, my name's Bridie Davis and I'm the Humanities Curriculum Partner. So I'm going to attempt now in a very short space of time to try and explain to you progression in humanities. It can be very challenging because an awful lot of the knowledge in humanities doesn't necessarily need to be taught in a specific order. Unlike subjects like maths and science, humanities curriculum doesn't need to be vertically integrated. So you don't necessarily need to teach A before you teach B, before you teach C. Now, having said that, there are some elements of our humanities curriculum that absolutely does need to be vertically integrated. So specifically our skills of inquiry and interpretation, and then also some elements of geography, more specifically physical geography. So one of the first things that I would pose to schools when they're thinking about planning progression in humanities is, what humanities knowledge and skills do you want children to progress in? And ultimately, why do you want them to progress in those knowledge and skills? So in order to help you answer this question, you first of all really need to have an understanding of the disciplines, as well as having a consideration for the framework. And specifically with the framework, you will need to look to our statements what matters and then the principles of progression. So I'm going to start by looking at the principles of progression and how these are pertinent within humanities. So one of the principles of progression states that children need to progress in their breadth and depth of knowledge. So I'm starting with knowledge because knowing stuff in humanities, for want of a better word, will help children become ethically informed citizens, which is one of the 4 purposes. But also you cannot achieve high level and sophisticated humanities skills or literacy skills without having knowledge. So knowledge really is power. So in order to progress in this principle, I often advise schools that children should develop their breadth and depth of knowledge of substantive concepts. So when I refer to substantive concepts, it's the substance that makes up the discipline. Another way of looking at it is looking at the body of knowledge that you would like children to progress in. So ultimately, what body of knowledge do you want children to increase their depth of knowledge in, and why? And when you've decided what substantive concepts you want them to progress in, you then obviously need to think about how they would progress in. Now, based on our knowledge of how the human brain works and cognitive science, if we want knowledge to transfer from our short-term to our long-term memory, we need to be developing schema of these substantive concepts. And a way to do that is to repeatedly revisit your chosen substantive concepts, but through a different context from the 3 to 16 continuum through their journey through school. So as we would revisit these substantive concepts, we would look at it through a different point of view, a point of view that becomes more complex, more challenging, and ultimately then you'll also be utilising the principles of the spiral curriculum theory. So another principle that children should progress in is to deepen their understanding and ideas within the disciplines. So this principle goes hand in hand with the breadth and depth of knowledge, because in order to progress in this principle, children need to deepen their understanding of the disciplines by looking at disciplinary concepts. Now, disciplinary concepts in humanities are also known as second order concepts or higher order concepts. Each of those phrases mean exactly the same thing. It's just different historians and different geographers often use the terms interchangeably. So examples of disciplinary concepts would include things like cause and effect, historical significance, change and continuity, geographical features, etc. Now, these types of concepts can't really be taught or assessed in isolation because they wouldn't really mean a great deal to children. They need to be taught and assessed alongside the substantive knowledge. So these types of concepts, they help give structure to knowledge in humanities, and they will help sequence learning. So they help turn facts into meaning, and obviously if it has true meaning and if it's taught well, then ultimately this will turn into understanding. So as you look at these types of concepts with children, they'll also be developing their schema of second order concepts, or the disciplinary concepts, alongside the substantive concepts. Now, you'll find these disciplinary concepts in our 3rd, 4th and 5th statement of what matters in humanities, and then progression of these disciplinary concepts are identified in the descriptors of learning. This is often why the framework in humanities can be challenging, because it doesn't necessarily tell you what to teach. So in order for children to progress in these two principles, schools will need to match the most appropriate disciplinary concepts to their chosen substantive concepts. And on the screen is an example of how this could look. So this is the concept of landscapes. So if we were teaching about landscapes and we wanted children to develop their breadth and depth of knowledge of landscapes, you would potentially look at the cultural importance of that landscape, the geographical features, how that has changed over time, and perhaps the human impact on the landscape as well. So just moving on to the next slide then. Here we go, where you'll see some other ones flagged up. The document was too big, sorry, to put on one slide. But we would probably also, in looking at the landscape, look at spatial patterns. I've already mentioned change over time, and it would be really hard not to talk about sustainability, and also then the impact that our decisions have on the landscape. So in terms of progression of making connections and transferring learning into new contexts, this goes hand in hand with the breadth and depth of knowledge and deepening their understanding of the ideas within the disciplines. Because as learners progress, they should be able to make links such as connections between periods of time, places, identifying similarities and differences, etc. And then ultimately be able to transfer their knowledge in humanities elsewhere in the curriculum and also when they leave school. So children do also then need to progress in their refinement and growing sophistication of skills. So for us in humanities, this means the skills of inquiry skills and interpretation skills. And these align to our 1st and 2nd statement of what matters. So this aspect of humanities does need to be vertically integrated. So children need to master A before they move on to B, and then they need to master B before they move on to C, and so on. So in terms of inquiry, in geography, this is traditionally known as geographical fieldwork, and in history, we undertake inquiries to discover and answer questions about the past. So they are two slightly different inquiries, although there are certainly overlaps between the two. But in history, we progress in our skills of using primary and contemporary sources to answer questions about the past. We imagine what the past was like, and then as a child progresses, they can make judgments on how useful and reliable those sources are in helping them answer questions about the past. In geography, which has parallels with a science experiment, as children progress, they'll investigate more challenging issues. They'll become increasingly independent and competent at planning, collecting data, presenting, analysing, and reaching conclusions. Now, in terms of interpretation skills, at the very early stages, children would be developing their understanding of their own opinions, then the understanding the opinions of others. And then as they progress, they should understand that there are different versions of the past, whether that be events and people. And then they should also then take that further in understanding why people have different interpretations, and then ultimately discussing how valid these interpretations are. So in terms then of progression of increasing effectiveness as a learner, this goes hand in hand with the growing sophistication of skills in humanities, because these two principles together are how historians and geographers work. So as a learner becomes effective learner in humanities, they will independently ask sophisticated inquiry questions, they'll collect their own evidence and their own data, they'll evaluate this, determine usefulness, reliability, validity, etc. So what is important to note is that skills in humanities should not be taught in isolation of knowledge. Skills and knowledge should always be taught side by side, and they should go hand in hand, because a child will struggle to achieve high-level humanities skills and literacy skills, like I mentioned at the start, without having knowledge to go alongside it. And then finally, making connections and transferring learning, once again, also applies to the skills in humanities, not just the knowledge. So, for example, analysing a piece of historical evidence is very similar to how you might analyse a piece of literature, art, music, and as previously mentioned, a geographical fieldwork study is very similar to a science experiment. So a burning question then is often, what do we assess in humanities? And ultimately it comes down to the question, what do you want them to know and do by the end of the unit of work, block of learning, topic, project? Different schools use different terminology. So a method that I advocate to help with this is the backwards design method by Wiggins and McTeague. And I see this as a little bit like using a sat nav. You put in your end goal and it gives you a route and a direction of where you need to get there. So you need to achieve progression by design and your intention rather than just by luck. So ultimately learners will truly understand because you have designed their learning. So just as an example of how this could look then, so we looked earlier at the disciplinary concepts that would apply when looking at the substantive concept landscapes. So if you planned something like this before the learning, you would ultimately know what you want the children to be working towards, what's those end goals, and then ultimately what expectations you have and what do you want them to know and do. So I appreciate that on the slide this isn't probably very clear, but this template, if you haven't seen it before, starts with the transfer goal. So what's the end goal? Ultimately, without a teacher, what would you want learners to know and be able to do when they leave your classroom and ultimately then when they leave school? So the middle section here then is the meaning. So Wiggins and McTeague believe that when children truly understand, they're able to explain, they're able to interpret things, they're able to have self-knowledge, predict, and so forth. So this middle section here is all about what ultimately can children explain, what can they judge, what can they evaluate, and so forth. The column on the left, the established goals, links to which elements of the framework this particular unit of work would be applicable to. And then finally, the bottom half of this template is the acquisition. So these are just the factual recall that children might have. So generally, what they might know in that moment in time, in that hour, but whether or not they could apply that knowledge would then be a question about whether they truly understand and whether they have achieved true meaning. So acquisitional knowledge is simply just about accepting what's true rather than necessarily debating it and questioning it. Simple things like 2 + 2, we just accept that, that's acquisition, we know it. So then moving on, I suppose then, how do we know children are progressing in humanities? So the list on the screen is just several examples of how you could assess in humanities. This is not an exhausted list, they're just a few things really. It would be advised to use a range of methods over a unit of work though, rather than just a summative approach. So the idea of listening to your learners, interviewing them, questioning them in class. So their verbal responses will help you judge if children are progressing. So if they are, children will be able to talk confidently and coherently about what they're learning, not just the processes that they're going through in class. They'll also be using sophisticated and disciplinary vocabulary, and they'll be able to tell you not just what they're learning, but why they're learning it. We'll start seeing them applying their learning across the curriculum. And ultimately, if they know more, they'll be able to talk more, they'll be able to write more, and not necessarily quantity, but quality as well. So they'll be able to write like historians and talk like historians and geographers and so forth. Can they evaluate? Can they explain why things happen? Can they make judgments? Can they describe processes? Can they analyse similarities and differences? Evaluate change and continuity? Can they debate, analyse, evaluate evidence? And if they can, then they are making progress in humanities. And as I said, no one form of assessment is going to capture a child's progress in humanities. We all have good days and bad days. Progress is a little bit like snakes and ladders, I think. We might show that we understand something one day, but that doesn't necessarily mean we'll be able to understand it next week. That's another key important reason why children need to be revisiting these types of concepts over time, but also children can plateau and they can reverse in their progress. So that's why a range of methods is really important in humanities. I'll take the silence as golden, but if anybody does have any questions, then feel free to get in touch, and I'm more than happy to do my best to answer them, or obviously chat in more detail about it.
Thank you very much, Bridie. I can see other people commenting as well how useful they found it. So thank you. Really comprehensive, really clear, really, you know, that understanding of progression and how that applies to humanities, you know, really brilliant. So thank you. And we'll move on to for our final presentation of today. I'm going to hand you over to Sean. Sean Powell, our digital lead for the region. Sean, you should be able to take control, and thank you very much.
Diolch, Sarah. Thank you very much. Thank you, Bridie, for your presentation on humanities there as well. It gave me a deeper understanding as well around progression in that area as well too. So thank you very much. So pronouns, everyone. My name's Sean. As Sarah was saying, I am the digital lead for the AS. My role is to support schools with development of digital skills and digital competence across the region. But before I kind of go into what progression looks like within digital skills, I always think it's important to kind of set the scene and give a bit of context around the importance of digital skills as part of our curriculum. So we'll start off thinking about the digital competency framework and the skills framework that we have to plan from. And I think when we consider digital skills across a curriculum, and we think historically, we tended to see as a skills application across a curriculum, digital being the weaker sibling, so to speak, the poorer relation to literacy and numeracy. And we tended to do lots of numeracy and literacy across the curriculum, probably because staff are more confident with the development of literacy and numeracy skills, and they're able to think of ways of developing them as part of the curriculum. And then what we saw was kind of a rush to get digital skills done. So it was a case of, right, let's do some research, let's put it onto a PowerPoint, and we've ticked the box for digital. And what we should really be seeing now is that the opportunities to develop literacy, numeracy and digital should be equal. And actually, if we're really savvy and really clever about how we can plan for literacy and digital skills together, hand in hand, and we can also plan for numeracy and digital skills together, hand in hand as well. So as we go through this presentation, I'm hoping that we'll be able to explore and see some ideas of how we can do this, but also how we can do that progressively within the curriculum as well. So in terms of resources that are available around the progression of digital skills, there is now a website available that looks at the specific development of digital skills across the learning continuum. Now, this website has been developed by the cross-regional partners and is available through the Supporting Our Schools website in the curriculum and assessment section under digital. But I'm just going to play a short video for you that takes you through what the website is and how the website can be used to support the planning for progression of digital skills in your curriculum. So hopefully you'll all be able to hear this. And if Sarah or Bridie can give me a nod if you can hear it, that'd be fantastic. Thank you. So here we have the Planning for Progression website looking at the development of digital skills across the curriculum, which has been developed by the cross-regional partners in Wales. Now the website is available both in English and in Welsh and can be accessed using the hexagons on the screen just by here. I'm going to demonstrate the English view, but this will look exactly the same in the Welsh language section as well. So as I click through to the site, I have an information section here which will provide me some further information around the rationale behind the website and how it can be used. But I also then have a second hexagon here that will look at the progression maps that are currently being developed. At present, we have 10 progression maps available. These range from podcasting and video production through to things such as computational thinking, spreadsheets, and website design. Now, the progression maps can be accessed by clicking on any of the hexagons on the screen or via the links here on the left-hand side. If I wish to toggle over to the Welsh site, I can simply select Cymraeg at the bottom, and that will then toggle through to the Welsh language versions of the exact same site. So just to demonstrate then what these look like, we've just selected the podcast progression map here. And the beauty about these progression maps is that on each of the maps, the format and the layout is exactly the same. So there's a consistency of an approach to a teacher when using this site. So each map will have a small introduction explaining what each digital tool or aspect is about and how it can be used in an authentic context. We then have a range of top tips to consider when planning, delivering and assessing for each of these maps, almost a bit like your pedagogical principles. And then we have a number of suggested apps or sites that can be used to develop that particular vehicle or aspect. Now, again, all of these apps are available either through the Hub platform or through the App Store. And where they are available for the App Store, we do ask schools to speak with their data compliance teams in the local authority to ensure they are ready for use. From there then, at each progression step, we provide a short example of what a good progression step one example of a podcast would be looking like or sounding like, and some examples then of how that could be developed or used in the classroom. As I scroll down then, I can see the skills that are going to be developed at that progression step. And this then progresses and develops on each other. So progression step 2, again, what does a good one look like? Here's some examples, and here are the skills that are going to be developed. So just to scroll through the site, you can see then there's a consistency of approach. The skills then develop on each other progressively and become more challenging all the way through to the end of progression step 5. Now, on top of the website that's been developed, we also have alternative printable versions that have been developed by the team at Partneriaeth. So on the top right-hand corner of each of the maps here, you can see there's an alternative printable version. If I select that hexagon, that will then take me through to a PDF, which hosts exactly the same content, but can be again printed off and used as a hard copy for schools should they need to. So just to take you through, as you can see, a little introduction, the suggested apps that are available, your top tips, how that relates across then to the DCF, and then each progression step, what a good one looks like, the skills that are available, and also then your how about section on how you could use that in schools as well. So just an overview of the website, and like I said, that is available through the Supporting Our Schools website under curriculum assessment and in the digital section. I'll pop the link in the chat a little bit later as well, so if you want to have a click through and explore, you can. But just to kind of provide that quick overview again, there were 10, there are now 13. So since that video was recorded, the progression map for cybersecurity, geographical information systems and presentations is now available as well. And you can see then a list of some of the other maps that we're sort of working on and developing in terms of developing the progression in digital skills. And I think the key thing to focus on and note about these progression maps is they're not to be used as a tick list. Okay, so we don't go through and say children could do this, children could do that. It's all about using the progression maps to develop their understanding of how skills can be used across a number of different digital vehicles and digital devices and software as well. And relating back to what Bridie was saying around the principles of progressions, really developing that deeper understanding of how they can apply their skill and knowledge across each of those disciplines. So what I thought would be a really nice example is to almost then take one of those progression maps and look at what does progression in this case animation look like, and how provide some examples of what that looks like from progression step 1 through to progression step 5. So just to kind of highlight then, a progression step 1, this is what we're saying a progression step 1 animation would look like, and some ideas then around the progression step 1 statements. And the skills then that we're particularly looking for are for children to be able to sequence a number of images, to think about how they create fine movements in the images that they're creating, and then also how they kind of collaborate and work together. So we're pulling on a number of the DCF skills in terms of interacting and collaborating and creating some digital content to create something as simple as the little GIFs you can see on the screen here. So these have been developed by children working at progression step 1, where they have essentially just moved a small number of images around a screen, collecting and creating a number of frames for that level. Now, if you're using the JIT tools as well within J2E and Hub, the wonderful thing about J2E is that they can now click on the microphone and talk over the top, explaining how they've gone about the process or talking about what's going on in their little animation there. So it's a simple example of progression step 1 animation. As we move to progression step 2 then, this becomes more complex and challenging. Again, some examples of what a good one looks like and some ideas around how you could do that in the classroom. But more specifically then, what skills are we going to be developing? You can see now that we're adding some extra layers to the progression step 1 skills. We're asking them to, again, consider movement and think about some shorter, smaller adjustments, leaving to that smoother illusion of movement. We're asking them to think about planning, and I think that's a really key thing that we need to consider when creating digital content, is actually storyboarding and sequencing and putting our ideas down for the children to be able to create. We're asking them to think about effects and software, and then to be creative and evaluate their work afterwards. So again, what we're hoping to demonstrate now is from that progression step 1 example onto a progression step 2 example here, where learners have used simple stop motion animation using pictures that they've designed and created themselves to create a short movie around a story called The Dirty Great Dinosaur. Again, Bridie and Sarah, if there's no sound, please let me know.
This is the tale of the Dirty Great Dinosaur. One sunny morning, Hal and little dog Billy were playing in the garden. Ruff, ruff, ruff! The ball, Billy. Ruff, ruff, ruff! All of a sudden, dun, 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 dun! Suddenly, a dirty great dinosaur charged in. I'm hungry and I come to eat you. Not fair. Then I eat your mum. Oh no, you won't. Then I eat your dad. Oh no, you won't. Then I eat your little dog Billy. Oh no, you won't. Go for it, Billy. Hal and Billy chased the dinosaur round the garden with the garden hose. They tied him up, and Hal knew the dinosaur promised never to eat people or dogs ever again. I'm still hungry. And I eat some lovely Scatty leaves. The dinosaur ate up all the food. The dinosaur ran away as fast as the great dinosaur can.
So a really lovely example there of a stop motion animation that was really led by the children. They designed all the backgrounds, the characters. You can see the real childlike touch to that in the way they've designed them. But if you consider back to those progression step 2 skills, lots of attention to detail in terms of the movement, thinking about not having their hands on the screen, the ability to add some sound effects. So the moment where the dinosaur broke through the fence, there was the crashing of the blocks that kind of came through that they'd recorded, and they'd also spent that time then really kind of planning and evaluating what was going well throughout. So I thought a really good example there of learners in year 1 and 2 collaborating and working together to create a really fantastic short film there during animation. So then we move to progression step 3, and we start to really consider now multiple components and making it more sophisticated, being able to really demonstrate ideas, to tell stories, and to do sort of things like that. In terms of skills then, the skills again becoming more complex. We're asking them now to really focus on quality and detail, thinking about frame rate. So how many frames are they going to have per second? Thinking about then adding in titles, text onto their videos as well. And again, just going a bit further with the planning and evaluation, and then spending some time to edit as well. So again, I'd like to share another example of a progression step 3 animation, which hopefully you can see now moves on further from the animation shown at progression step 2.
Blobs. Picnic blobs. So Gwelly blobs. And 2 blobs in a kite wig. I'w barhau gan Minnie Evans.
So there we have again another example of kind of taking that animation on a little bit further, really considering some of those multiple components. And I think you might have noticed throughout different types of camera shot as well. So you had some kind of long shots and up close shots as well. I think they had a lot of fun sort of putting in the sound effects as well as they were going through that process there. But again, just showing more sophistication of skills and applying that then to sort of storytelling and different contexts as well, which I thought was really, really nice. As we move to progression step 4, then you can see then that this is becoming more complex as they go through, and this is where they would move sort of into specific sessions on animation really in IT lessons up in the high school. But again, you can see now that the skills that they're developing are building on everything that they've worked on in previous progression steps, but again becoming more sophisticated and more complex in nature. Now, you might think that the outcome of the progression step 4 one isn't any stronger than the progression step 3 one, but actually the skills that have gone in to be able to develop progression steps, for example, are really, really sophisticated using sophisticated software such as the Adobe Animate tools within the Adobe Creative Cloud. So just to show you one final example then of progression step 4. It's a lot shorter than the other ones, but a lot of skill has gone into being able to develop this and to move the different assets around on the screen.
Thank you.
So again, very, very short in that case, and you might be thinking, oh, okay, that's not quite as sophisticated as the others. but the software that the children will have used to be able to develop that and to be able to move things across the screen are really kind of fundamental for them leading into taking Digitech at the GCSE qualification, where Adobe Animate is quite a challenging and tricky piece of software to use. So hopefully that's a nice demonstration really of how animation can progress from the very early stages of progression step 1 all the way through to progression step 3. And just to kind of then build on some of the work that Bridie was talking about with backwards design earlier, a really useful model and tool that I find for digital technology to think about integrating technology into your lessons and thinking outside the box and tweaking what we already do is something that called the SAMR model. Now, you may or may not have seen the SAMR model before, but as you can see on the screen, it stands for substitution, augmentation, modification, and redefinition. Now, it's a framework designed to guide teachers in integrating technology into their teaching practices in a meaningful way. Now, you can see that the model moves through 4 distinctive levels, each building upon the previous one, with the ultimate goal of encouraging transformative uses of technology in the classroom. So this can really help you think and consider how the progression of digital technology in the classroom can be really useful. So to take you through each level then really, we'll start with substitution, and this is where technology is used as a direct substitute with no functional change. So think of it as doing the same task, but using a technological tool instead. An example of this could be typing a document on a computer instead of handwriting it. It's a straightforward replacement without altering the nature of the task itself. Then we consider augmentation, and this is where technology is used to enhance the task with functional improvements. Now, this means that there's a noticeable improvement, but the task itself remains fundamentally the same. So, for instance, you might add a multimedia element like an image or a hyperlink to a presentation to make it more engaging and informative. Now we get on to modifications. This is where the challenge comes in, and this is where I feel like we need to be aiming for when thinking about the use of digital technology in the classroom. So this is where technology allows for a significant redesign of the task, providing new possibilities for teaching and learning. This goes beyond enhancement. It's about changing how the task is done. An example here could be where students collaboratively create a document online and they provide real-time collaboration and feedback, or they really change the outcome of the task from what it was previously designed to do. And finally, then, we consider redefinition. Now, this is where technology allows for the creation of a task that was previously inconceivable. So technology will transform the learning experience in ways that go beyond traditional teaching methods. For example, rather than writing a story, students might create an interactive branching narrative using digital platforms, or use things such as VR headsets or Minecraft education to create and really make something new with their learning. So let's have a look at that as an example. So in this example, the task or the children, the staff were thinking about presenting information about the life of Rosa Parks. So if I wanted to take that idea through the SAMR model, I would use it in this way. So initially, I could take my research about Rosa Parks, and instead of writing that down in my book and keeping those notes, I could type that information onto a Word document instead. If I move to augmentation then, I could still keep that information on a Word document, but instead now I'm going to add images, videos, hyperlinks to web pages or information to create that document but make it more interactive in nature. If I move through to modification now, instead of just essentially creating a task and creating that research, let's take that research and let's turn that into a podcast. So we could still do that research, we could still create links and images and multimedia, but we're now going to turn that research into a podcast that's going to share information as an engaging show or a documentary. So rather than just keeping it in our books, we're bringing it to life and making it authentic and real. Now, if we had the ability to, we could move to redefinition where we create that podcast, we create a VR experience where the learner will put on a VR headset and they would listen to then the information whilst being sat on the bus and looking at images of everything that was going on around them. So the Samba model for me is a really useful way of thinking about how we can integrate technology into our lessons so that we get to a point where we have our different AOLEs, our digital competence and our numeracy and literacy skills all going hand in hand together. So I hope that's been a useful overview this afternoon of progression of some of the digital skills and helps us to think a little bit about how we integrate digital technology into our teaching and learning. If there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them now. And just as I finish, I'll pop the link to the website in the chat so that you can have a little browse in your own time. But thank you very much, everyone. And if anyone has any questions, please fire away.
And thank you very much, Sean. A great presentation. I really loved seeing your examples, your animations, really fantastic work from the pupils. And again, a fantastic resource, those progression maps. I know they'll be really useful to everybody that accesses them. So thank you very much. And I'm just looking to see if we've got any questions coming through in the chat. No, just really positive. Thanks, really interested and useful, and people suggesting that they're going to share them with their DCF leads. And obviously the video will be available. So if you do want any of your AOLE leads to have a look at this session, they can just go straight to the section that's relevant to the specific lead that you have in your school to have a look at what's been said today. So thank you very much, everyone, for presenting. If we've no questions, I will say goodbye and thank you very much.